This is from another generation. So we've talked about the economic impact of the oligarchy then. So now we will talk about more about crony capitalism. So our next reactor is a full professor and research fellow of political science and international studies at the La Salle University, Manila, or DLSU. Currently, he represents the Philippines in the Council of the International Political Science Association, or IPSA. He completed both his doctorate in development studies with distinction and his bachelor's degree major in political science from DLSU. He earned his master's degree in political science from the University of the Philippines. He specializes in the comparative analysis of politics and development in East and Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on issues of popular participation, governance, democratization, and contested institutions. He has published extensively on the topics of elections, party politics, and political dynasties. Very, very interesting topics. So here to provide his thoughts on crony capitalism vis-a-vis the discoveries on the book, please help me welcome, fresh from Kyoto, Japan, former Dean of the DLSU College of Liberal Arts, Dean Julio Teehankee. Take it away, Dean July.
Thank you, Leon. Correction, I am still in Kyoto University. I'm still stuck here. I've been stranded for close to 3 months already, but I'm not complaining. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this very important book launch, the Ateneo University Press and the Ateneo School of Government. And I think it is a clear signal or symbol of unity that Ateneans and Lasallians can join together for a common cause, especially for the good of the country. So I would like to present my reaction to the book that is quite important for me, because I think in the panel of reactors for this morning's launch, I think I'm the one who's really a martial law baby. No? I remember when I was in high school, immediately after the assassination of Ninoy Aquino, I read The Octopus as one of the illegal Xerox copies being circulated at La Salle Green Hills during that time. So I also was in, I was doing my master's at UP when Some Are Smarter Than Others was first published. And I was an avid collector of the Smart File series that was also edited by Rick Manapa. So for this, for my reaction, I'd like to also give homage to the very first article that I read about Oligarchs and Cronies. This is exactly the title of an article that I read when I was doing my graduate studies in 1991, around the same time that Some Are Smarter Than Others was published. And this is the first article of Paul Hutchcroft that I read during that time. My task for this morning is that I'd like to situate the importance of Rick Manapa's Some Are Smarter Than Others in the overall literature of oligarchy and crony capitalism in political science, in political economy, and in social science in general. Let me begin. Of course, last week, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, Filipinos were waiting for our president to present us with his plans on how we will deal with this existential crisis. Instead, we were treated by the usual populist narrative of the very same source of his political capital, which depended on the depiction of society as being divided between an us against them narrative, or in his case, the so-called pure people versus the so-called corrupt elite. And the corrupt elite in his narrative is, of course, the oligarch. And one of the highlights of his State of the Nation address was he actually identified the dismantling of the oligarchy without declaring martial law. Of course, we all know that he was referring to the fact that he succeeded through his allies in Congress in defeating the franchise bill of ABS-CBN. Of course, for those of us who lived through the Marcos years, our generation of the martial law babies, this reminded us of what Marcos did actually in 1972. And uh, looking at rereading Some Are Smarter Than Others, there are interesting passages in the book. And the most important chapter for me in the book is actually chapter 2, in which Rick really detailed the origins of crony capitalism in the Philippines. I would like to focus on one particular crony of Ferdinand Marcos, who actually benefited from uh, what Marcos did in 1972. If you will recall, in 1972, the main reason given by Ferdinand Marcos in the declaration of martial law was really he said he will launch a revolution from the center to defeat the extreme right and the extreme left. Of course, when he said extreme left, he was referring to the communist insurgency. And he referred to the oligarchs or the oligarchy as being part of the extreme right. And part of that was appropriating and closing down first ABS-CBN and much of the assets of the Lopez family, which was then considered the number one oligarch in the pre-martial law era. But looking at the chapter 2 of Some Are Smarter Than Others, particularly in page 143, this was what Rick wrote about how Ricardo S. Benedicto, the late Roberto S. Benedicto, benefited from the closure of ABS-CBN. And I quote, "The small radio station that Benedicto ran before martial law was transformed into the Canlaon broadcasting system, a gigantic tri-media empire covering 3 TV channels, 228 15 radio stations, and national newspaper, the Daily Express. The nucleus for this network came from the privately owned ABS-CBN. Under the guise of the national security, the military first took over the facilities on 8th of June 1973. So, of course, we all know that Channel 2 was transformed into Channel 9 and became one of the primary propaganda outlet of martial law. Which leads me to the conclusion, or which leads me to the observation when I was interviewed regarding President Duterte's so-called war on oligarchy. I said in an interview that one president's oligarchy was another president's crony. Because to my mind, the real issue is crony capitalism, or the use of political connections instead of productivity to accumulate and defend material wealth. And if we will look at the top business conglomerates or organizations in the Philippines, some of the big corporations took decades, even centuries to build. There are certain new players that in a span of 4 years have already become one of the major players in our economy. Now, this system of crony capitalism, to my mind, is perpetuated in collusion with what is also known as the elite of power, or the political class, largely composed of political dynasties. Which leads me to a typology that was first introduced by the late political scientist David Werfel, who distinguished between the elite of wealth and the elites of power. No? The oligarchs are a subset or a part of the socio-economic elite, or the elite of wealth. And of course, in recent years, we have seen that some of the so-called billionaires have maintained their influence and their economic wealth, but there are other new players as well. And in the Filipinos on the Forbes list of billionaires, the Lopezes have already, new billionaires have already eclipsed the wealth and the political power of the Lopez family. The elites of power refer to the political class. And in the Philippines, of course, we all know that uh, clans and not parties are the main building block of Philippine politics, particularly in elections. And largely, the elites of power belong to the so-called political dynasties. No? Nathan Kimpo, another political scientist based in Tsukuba, Japan, uh, uh, observed that the oligarchic elite is the combination of both wealth and power. So there are those elite of wealth who manage to cross over to the realm of politics and combine both politics and economy as their source of power and privilege. Now, another interesting part about some are smarter than others are the main arguments that Manapat raised. No? Like, for example, the central characteristic of Marcos's crony capitalism was the use of political power for political gain. Now, this definition of crony capitalism predates all the other later scholarly work on crony capitalism. And according to Rick, the Marcos school altered the historically established role of the traditional oligarchy and other political and economic patterns in Philippine life. From the dissolution of some of the old social forces and the coalescing of new ones, emerged a new set of actors which form a new oligarchy spawned by the Marcos school. So despite Marcos's avowed goal of dismantling the oligarchy, he simply created a new set of oligarchy from his small circle of cronies. The new elite was nothing more than a large subset of the old oligarchy. And segments of the old oligarchy built alliances with the new oligarchs in order to survive. So some alliances with the old oligarchy were destroyed only to create newer and stronger alliances between the old elements and the new crooks. Okay. This also echoes an important work that was published around 1995 out of the doctoral dissertation of Temario Rivera. And this is also a book that is already out of print that needs to be reissued. No? His classic work, Landlords and Capitalists, Class, Family, and State in Philippine Manufacturing. And the book also reflects and echoes what Totti detailed in his reaction, that the oligarchies both cause and affect the large inequitable economic system of the country. The uncanny ability of the traditional elites, the old oligarchs, to transform themselves into capitalists and through and real estate regulation. Speaking of rent seeking, the book is the classic work of our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Paul D. Hotchcroft. Capitalism focus on the banking sector, but of course, the main point of the book was the access to the state apparatus has been the major avenue to private accumulation as the quest for rent-seeking opportunities brings a stampede of favored elites and would-be favored elites to the gates of Malacanang Palace. This was written in the 90s, and there is still a lot of truth to this observation up until the present. State apparatus has repeatedly been choked by an anarchy of particularistic demands from and particularistic actions on behalf of those oligarchs and cronies. Internationally, there is also another recent work by Jeffrey Winters, which attempts to, of course, oligarchy, just like most concepts in the social sciences, is a contested one. There are various definitions, but the latest attempt at coming out with a exact definition of what oligarchy is all about is the political scientist Jeffrey Winters in his 2015 book, in which he defined oligarchs as the actors who command and control massive concentrations of material resources that can be deployed to defend or enhance their personal wealth and exclusive positions. So oligarchs refer to those individuals of extreme wealth who use their position of wealth and power to defend or enhance their personal wealth. So there are billionaires and there are billionaire oligarchs who would use their resources to defend and to further enhance their wealth through the use of political power. Okay? So oligarchy does not simply refer to the old oligarchy, as some defenders of the current administration are saying. No? So oligarchy can also refer to those who try to secure and maintain and retain his or her position of extreme wealth and power against all manner of threats. So even the so-called elite of power can be considered part of the oligarchy. Another important work about crony capitalism in 2004, David Kang, a American-Korean political scientist, compared the experience of both South Korea and the Philippines. Both underwent dictatorship. Both similarly attempted to replicate the so-called developmentalist state model of Japan. Both suffered from money politics or corruption. But how come South Korea succeeded in developing while the Philippines was further buried into underdevelopment? And according to David Kang, in Korea, the so-called chaebols were disciplined, or they were first allowed to compete among themselves, and the winner would then get all the support from the state, following the same path of development as the so-called developmentalist state model of Japan. In the Philippines, while Marcos identified champions in several sectors in the Philippine economy, like sugar and banana and other sectors of the economy, they were not competitive, but rather they were all rent-seeking. My last two slides. Of course, the very term crony capitalism emerged from the Marcos the dictatorship, no? From the Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos dictatorship. Rick Manapat was among the first to use the term crony capitalism. It was later picked on by Time magazine, and it was reintroduced to the world during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, when crony capitalism was used as one of the major explanations for the crisis of 1997, particularly in Indonesia with Suharto and his own set of crony capitalists. And then the term crony capitalist became an accepted term worldwide, both in scholarly and popular media, particularly in reference to the emergence of crony capitalism under Russia, under Vladimir Putin, and more recently in Malaysia with the Najib scandals. No? So crony capitalism continues to be a feature of autocratic and illiberal regimes and is a continuing threat to democracy. So, what is crony capitalism all about? It's about simply competition or the lack of it. And I remember also saying in an interview with ABS-CBN that if you just target one or two families and then you ignore the others, or if you don't totally consider changing fundamentally what is wrong with the structure, and the system, then that is not reform. That is simply partisan politics. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Maraming salamat.